if you wish to speak, to clerk@nctd.org. I will now ask Suhail Rodriguez, our wonderful clerk of the board, to please call the roll.
Thank you, Chair. Board Chair Jewel Edson,
Yes.
Vice Chair Patel,
Here.
Board Member Jenkins,
Here.
Board Member Contreras.
Present.
That concludes the roll call.
Thank you. Suhail, please provide a safety brief and review of the evacuation procedures.
Certainly. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Thank you, Suhail. Next on our agenda is public communications. Do we have any public comments today?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. At this time, public registration to speak on this item will end. Before we dive further into today's agenda, for the sake of efficiency, I have a couple of quick protocol items to share. First, I ask that board members hold comments and questions until after each agenda item has been presented. Second, when the time comes for board member questions and comments, please raise your hand, like real hands, and I'll call on you to speak, hopefully in the order in which you've raised them. The first item on today's agenda is an update on Nctd's strategic plan. Lori Goffagan. Okay. A consultant with Performance Works will provide an update on Nctd's strategic plan, then respond to feedback from the executive committee on next steps. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair and members of the board. It is a pleasure to be here in person with all of you. And thank you for introducing Lori Goffagan, who is from Performance Works. She'll be offering us a detailed update on where we are with a refresh of our strategic plan, as well as describing our next steps. Next slide. So before I hand things over to Lori, I'd like to review the overall context of why we are taking a look at our strategic plan and what we expect this work to feed into in order to accomplish our mission and our vision. As we have all experienced, the last few years have been somewhat challenging, and organizations like Nctd are taking a look at whether the current strategies that are in place today will serve us as we move into the future. We're also about to launch a formal planning process for our fiscal year 2024 budget year, during which we'll develop proposed goals and initiatives that this board will review. These goals will be further refined into strategic areas of focus, business plan initiatives, and finally divisional goals, all of these driven by and aligning with our overall strategic plan. Ultimately, as we develop the final framework for the plan, we intend for it to include a clear description of our shared values and vision, to reflect a broad perspective from all stakeholders, that it will lay out a path for enhanced organizational capacity, and finally, that everyone across the district will have a full understanding and awareness about any changes that are coming up for our future. So we wanted to come before you today to hear any additional feedback that you might have for us as we move into the next phase of developing the plan. So at this time, I would like to turn things over to Lori so she can provide that update.
Thank you. Hi there. So happy to be here today. Actually have spoken to all of you on the phone in February and March, a couple of you more than one time. And so, happy to see you in person and be able to share a little bit of this information with you. As Laura set the context, this work has been about taking a step back in order to take a step forward and to solicit feedback and input from a broad array of stakeholders to be able to paint sort of a complete picture of the agency operationally, organizationally, culturally, from the perspective of those who work here, those who serve, and those for whom the agency serves. And so today is to just take a few minutes, because we understand that you have quite an agenda, and given it's the first time you all have been together, is to give you a little bit of feedback about the external perspective. So what we heard from you all, from the board, from mayors, and from some from some of the business partners. So that's sort of the frame for today. And hopefully you guys can, you can see the slides as well, right? So, this was really about creating a shared vision, which is ultimately about alignment, right? For all involved. And to have the plan ultimately, as I said, informed by this broad perspective, broad stakeholder feedback. So we're not talking to ourselves, right? It's about how do we bring fresh eyes to understand the problem, with the goal of improving capacity to support performance, and as much to provide this sort of district-wide understanding so that everybody's on the same page, because we understand all too well in organizations that people very often see the world through their own lens. And this is, to provide a shared view of what the priorities are, what the perspectives are, and the plan going forward. So Suhail, next slide, please. A little bit about our process. We embarked on this work thinking that it would be about a 2-year project. And we're really sort of like almost hitting the 12-month mark. And we've, the pace, the cadence of the project has changed a bit over the past year, but really the effort to date has been very much focused on discovery and data collection. And we've done that through a number of vehicles, through interviews, through employee focus groups, most notably assembling task forces made up of employees from staff from throughout the agency to actually take a deep dive and focus on some of the issues that were surfaced, so that we begin to develop solutions in the form of recommendations and objectives that are representative of employee perspective, not just, how to say, an outside consultant coming in and saying, I know the answer. And so this is really developing solutions that are from the inside out. Ultimately, where we are now is to share this work with you. We are developing an action plan in the 4th quarter of 2022 with the goal of focusing on implementation in the new year. Next. We went back to what is. So the what is in the form of the vision, in the form of the mission, to really check ourselves and to say, are we the agency that we want to be? Are we doing work that is representative of our vision and mission? And really beginning with this primary sort of foundational statement of our mission is to deliver safe, convenient, reliable, user-friendly public transportation. And I know it was a while ago when we all spoke, but even the first question that I talked with all of you about was, yes, we have this mission, but from your perspective, what do you think is the most important thing about the work that NCT does? Because there's always a mission statement, but then there's the reality of how do we put that to practice. Next slide. We took a cue from the strategic priorities, which are in the budget document, to say, these are the areas of focus that informed the work from the very beginning, looking at ridership, looking at projects, looking at equity, revenue, expenses, and really to say, okay, if this are all of the elements that are factors in the operations and in the ongoing operations of the agency, this is the sort of the springboard that we use to inform the work. So who did we talk to? Where did the information come from? We had multiple meetings with chiefs, with directors. As I said, we held focus groups, 6 employee focus groups with over 50 employees participating. We spoke to all of you, to North County mayors. We did some best practice interviews with comparable agencies. We talked to some business partners. And then we actually also distributed a survey, which was a culture survey that was administered through a survey research company called Denison. And what was really amazing about that is that we had over 75% of the employees respond. And by their own records, we're really good if you hit 50, and normally it's 25 to 35%. So we felt like this was a really strong indication of how deeply employees care and how committed they are to the work and how valuable they felt like having an opportunity to have their voice, be part of this work. Next, please. So if we move into a little bit about, what did we hear from you all? That most important to stakeholders and to the board was this idea that we have a responsibility to be a place for regional thinking related to both transit and community needs. And that manifests in sort of three specific points: that we're an engine for innovation to better serve the region, that we're a bridge builder and we're a leader convening cities in North County and partners, and that there's a long-term strategy that's driven by data and ultimately designed to have impact. So the frame was, how do these priorities get factored into how we think about regional transportation planning? Next. A couple of key points about, this idea of where the agency shines. Consistent feedback that the execution is strong, there's strength in service, quality and safety. You'll notice that the structure on all of these slides is the same, where there's a roll-up statement and then excerpts of actual quotes from the people that we spoke to. So we focus on providing excellent customer service. Kudos to the customer service team. We're all about the customer and service in all modes, everything we're geared towards no delays. Another high point is the feedback from you all, that a lot of respect for leadership and for the staff, and at the same time, a desire to be more involved in an integral and strategic level. So some of the specific comments, people give their all. They want to be the best. There's a strong drive to move forward. It's a strong team that really cares about work. But how can we have conversations about the future of transit? How can we be part of, as I said, more strategic conversations that inform the direction of the agency, and not such that we're on the receiving end of information and we don't really have time or space to actually debate or engage. Some of the issues that are top of mind that came out. We need to do a better job to set a vision for the region. What does future ridership look like? How do we solve the last mile challenge? I can't tell you how many times that theme came up from all of you. Notionally, that, this concern that we're not positioning ourselves for what's next. We're not positioning ourselves for new ideas. We're so focused on delivery. We're so focused, which is a strength, on quality of the experience, but we need to be looking into the future. As with every business, industry, agency in our world, the pandemic shifted how we need to think about serving the community. How, it's important to dive deeper into community needs, look at income levels, look at travel patterns, look at the customer mix. How do we think about transit as being a choice as opposed to, sort of a last resort? That we need to do better in outreach. We need to do a better job of connecting with the people that we serve. On a sort of a different level, feedback around Nctd being seen as a necessary platform for regional thinking. How can we be a platform for shared discussion? So an extension of this idea of the board being more involved. Board meetings aren't a place to have deep strategic discussions. Maybe we need a special workshop. How can we ensure the right constituents are part of the process? And then another point about looking for clarity with priorities and a plan. So how do we focus on streamlining efficiency, expanding services and ridership? How do we make microtransit and flexibility a greater priority? So we need this platform for discussion, and we need clarity about priorities in a way that we don't feel like we have at present. Lastly, if we move beyond the board for a minute, feedback from business partners, from mayors looking for more active collaboration. You know, if we really are a regional entity, then how can we do a better job at being more inclusive in bringing outside perspectives into our planning? How can we create more formal working relationships around specific initiatives? How can we coordinate and plan ahead of time so that we better deploy our resources? So, you know, just the themes in general from the external stakeholders were largely around collaboration, a desire for more collaboration, a desire for deeper strategic conversations, confidence in a future orientation and a future mindset, alongside this recognition that staff is working really hard, people are accessible, they are available, they are engaged, and to take nothing away from the staff and the leadership in that area, but we want more. You want to go? Sure, thanks. So where this led, we took the information, you know, literally lay everything out, and you start to look for themes and connecting the dots. And we saw a roll up into 4 major categories or areas of focus. One is around mission and strategy, right? This idea of clarifying priorities, building cohesion amongst the leadership team. A secondary focus on engagement and development, which is how do we recognize the accomplishments of staff? How do we invest in staff so that they grow to help them do their job better? Leadership and culture, how can we instantiate behaviors within the agency that we all adhere to around how we communicate, how we engage, how we coach, how we develop? How can we be more intentional and more consistent in our communication, both internally and externally? And then lastly, tied to the national diversity, equity, inclusivity, belonging pilot that we're part of for APTA, how can we begin to be more proactive and more intentional about a focus on equity, inclusivity, diversity, and belonging in all of our practices? So we sort of use that as a foundation so that it rolls up and informs the work we do on mission and strategy, the work we do on engagement and development, as well as leadership and culture. So where we are now is, as we've been working with the chiefs the past couple of months, to say we took information from task forces that created a whole series of objectives and key results that tracked to those previous issues around leadership and culture, engagement, development, mission strategy, as well as DEIB, and say, what does that look like in terms of a plan to go forward? How do we begin to synthesize that and roll that up into strategic priorities or imperatives that we can build an action plan around? And so where we are now is looking at these 3 major categories as the guiding strategic priorities for the strategic plan framework going forward of operational excellence, organizational excellence, and community connection. And the work to be done now is to say, how do we take all of the recommendations that came out of the task forces, everything that we learned from all of the various stakeholders, convert those to an action plan that roll up under each of those 3 categories that give us tasks, activities, milestones, and metrics to guide us for the next 2 years. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing and where we are. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add? Laura, anything you'd like to add? No, thank you. You're good? Okay. So, open to you guys. Questions, thoughts, reactions?
I have to get used to turning on a microphone again. Before we move to board member questions, I would ask Sahil if there are any public comments on this agenda item.
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. At this time, public registration to speak on this item has ended. So we'll move to board questions. Priya?
I might have to borrow your mic.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it
Yeah.
working? Okay, great. So, I think the light's off. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So thank you. Thanks, first of all, for the presentation. And I do remember we were able to
did,
have
yeah,
that conversation
did.
so early on. And for me, just being able to see it all come together is always exciting. And I do have a few questions. I'll try to make it as quickly as possible so others can chime in as well. But I wanted to start off with just a really simple question. I noticed for the North County mayors, we mentioned there were 5 of them. Are you able to or allowed to tell us which ones had responded? Just because obviously like we have some that are board members. And so I just wanted to make sure that wasn't the overlap and
Right.
we were getting unique information.
Matt Hall,
Okay.
Catherine Blakespear, Rebecca Jones, Lisa Hebner, Ryan Keem, and Terry Gasterlin.
Okay, great. Perfect. And then I know we mentioned pandemic shift with community engagement, just how that shifted what we do with community engagement or what we do in terms of, looking at ridership, et cetera. And I know from the very beginning, since I've been on the board, something that I've talked about is like my demographic and my generation, young folks. And I mean, I might not be on the young spectrum in a few years, but for however long I am, I can talk about it. And so one of the things that I was just,
the age range of millennials keeps extending.
I know, right? It does. It does. And so, speaking of millennials, that was something where this might be coming out of the marketing committee that we have, but just curious, what we're thinking about in terms of addressing that gap of like making sure that young people see this as convenient, flexible, something that they'd actually want to utilize versus having to utilize other means of getting around.
Yeah, that would probably be more so in the marketing
Okay,
realm of discussion. And I know there's an upcoming
great.
marketing meeting. And we'll make sure that we touch upon that.
Perfect. Yeah, because I know we said, a theme that came out is wanting to make sure transit is a choice, right? And so that's something that I think if we make it, obviously, like since I know it's been a few years since I've been on the board, but it's like we all are wanting to make it as frequent, as convenient as possible. And so like I think especially for millennials, how do you make it more exciting, right? How do we market so it's more exciting to want to
So,
utilize?
so I was looking at Chris's face. I couldn't figure out what he was saying, but I remember what he was trying to prompt me and remind me. So you received several presentations from Deloitte,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so we're now coming up on the milestone for Deloitte to do 2 additional presentations.
Okay.
And really what that is capturing across all different market demographics
Cool.
and developing and reviewing our strategies to help us chart a course for first no regret decisions. And then how do we really focus in on things that make most sense based upon that market information. So that is happening. That's information that the board has received the preliminary presentations. But now we're coming down to the final stages of the really good detail and feedback and potential policy considerations for the board.
Great. Yeah. And I mean, I know that we have the youth opportunity pass, but anybody above that age group, right? Like is also in that kind of, I feel like the missing middle is what I tend to say for a lot of things, but it's like that demographic of like 25 to 35 tends to be, I mean, forgotten in some sense for a lot of things. So as much as we can think about ways that we can get those young working professionals from where they're, from their home to their workplace is something that I would be really interested to hear about.
Priya, what just to add to the framework that we're developing is to be able to create a dashboard or a roadmap for you all as the board, as well as for the agency that says, these are the priorities, these are the
Totally.
initiatives, and this is the work that's going to be done. And so ultimately, we're looking at integrating, whether it's marketing and communications, whether it's bus and rail, whether it's internal administrative and staff, into a synthesized document so that we can all see the work that
Perfect.
we're going to be doing together.
Perfect. And then I know the other thing, I saw the feedback about how do we work more hand in hand with some of the other, the cities across the cities that we serve, obviously. And I was this might be more of a Matt question. Just curious, how we continue to keep cities informed of plans step by step. I know, but just for the public's perspective. And then can we get report outs on how and where we're engaged with those cities as well?
Yes, we can. And this is one of those things because, constantly you think you're communicating and sharing information and collaborating. It really depends on what person is focused on and what things they pay attention to. I'll just note, like, if you look at, we do a whole lot of information push outs to the community and to key stakeholders and elected officials. I think one of the bigger challenges where we're going to need the elected official help is, how do we get that information out in a way that people actually look at it, absorb it, or the presentations? We had some discussions, if you remember, for those of you who are on the executive committee pre-COVID, we were looking at doing similar to Cal State San Marcos, kind of a state of the district type of event. Because for a lot of these things, we know that we're not going to get full attention of elected officials, but if we could create at least a moment where we could have kind of some wow moments that would kind of be at the top of their mind. So it's going to be a series of different things. Chris and his team have produced an internal document, internal communication tool link that I think it has really good information that we need to figure out how to get it out to board members and other key stakeholders. So I hear that loud and clear. It's just one of these continuous things, and then trying to figure out with some people, how do we actually connect with you? Because again, some of the communication for me, it would be like challenging to not understand, well, why aren't we communicating to you? I believe we are communicating with you. So what's the message that we're missing here? Is this a one issue thing that you're saying we're not listening to you, not collaborating? So we got to dig down deeper into it. But again, the approach that I've tried to take with this, to be very candid, is I'm not going to agree with necessarily all of the feedback that you receive, because there's always a ton of nuance, and I mean broader than just this. But if you move past the point that I'm not going to do point and counterpoint with you, it just means let's just dig down deeper and figure out what are the additional steps and additional activities that we can take to try to address that as a core theme, if it's something that makes sense.
And at the staff level, do we have someone who's like a liaison for each city, or is it generally just you?
Number one, I wouldn't,
Okay.
even if we could afford it, I wouldn't want to have a liaison for each city, but we do collaborate with all of the cities.
Sure,
I mean,
of course.
and so I think let's give the example. So we review the agendas, for example, for Sandak, and we push that out. When we do our service plan and budget each year, we push that out to communication out to the cities, and we do the feedback. For each of your cities, when you guys have major development, that information comes into us. We review your plans and we send communication and feedback. And I think part of this is we're not doing a good enough job of telling our story, because so much of the things that I hear in here, because I heard in one of these things, someone said we were not being innovative, and they talked about microtrans and this thing. And for everything they identified were things we were absolutely working on. And I also recognize sometimes we have a gap, because for board members, you guys are really busy. This is maybe your third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh job. You may not remember all of the projects and all of the activities that we're engaged in, unless you're like Karina and you spend significant time bonding with me, going through the detail of projects, right? And that's why I think we really have to just say, not debate. Let's figure out, how do we communicate and improve the communication of information that's out there. You all know we're working on microtransit, first and last mile. It's been major discussion at the board, but I suspect we could go and talk to some board members, if just ad hoc, and ask them about what Nctd is doing on microtransit. I suspect I have no idea, maybe nothing. Maybe let me talk to Matt. So our staff talks with all of the city staff on relevant and different projects and activities. We communicate on the joint legislative letter. So there's a ton of communication and collaboration. We probably can put together something to kind of show you and illustrate it. But I think it goes against the point of, if people are saying that we need to enhance the communication, let's enhance the communication in a much more intentional way. Maybe documenting is an important thing to show people this is how we communicate and interact with you to help people. But I think at the end of the journey, you're still going to have it, have feedback, because sometimes people only engage on items they care about.
Yeah, and before I move on to my next question, I would just say perhaps it's like doing a presentation to our councils, because I know sometimes we have Sandag, for instance. Is that what I'm writing? Just because I think that would be helpful. I mean, it doesn't have to be all the time, but whether it's biannually, quarterly, whatever that looks like in terms of frequency, and obviously everyone's schedules. But I think obviously we're board members and we're here and we're present, but like you said, other elected officials, unless we provide that report out to them, they aren't receiving that report out. So, yeah.
I agree. And historically, I think we've done that a few times where we've gone to each of the city councils, and, sometimes you can tell come this time, but we don't want you to come too frequently. But that is, again, part of this is it's going to be us, because not just Nctd, and I mean our board members, because you drive the cadence and with your city in terms of the frequency of Nctd coming to your board agenda. There's no doubt if you as a respective city say, hey, Matt, we want you guys to come monthly, we'll come monthly. If you said come weekly, we'll come weekly. If you said come quarterly, we'll come quarterly. If we come annually, come annually. Part of this is, I do think we need to make sure we're creating kind of greater ownership and awareness of that you guys are driving the bus or the train or whatever vehicle you are, and being intentional and helping us to engage, because you're going to be a better gauge as the representative of that agency, how much we should be and how we should engage.
Yeah. And I mean, as we said, we want I think it was either a mission and part of the mission or vision, or I don't know, it was part of something in this, that we said we want to be seen as a leader in terms of transit. And so to me, that means being very actively engaged with all of our cities, because otherwise, like, with so many of these regional agencies, North County in general gets ignored. And I think it's so important for us to have that ability to say, well, we have our agency that's paying attention to us and doing things for us that are important. So that's the reason why I bring that up, is if there's a way for us to do more in terms of engagement. I know we're doing as much as we can, but I think taking it a step further and just providing that would be helpful. I'll try to wrap up quickly, I promise. I just have two more things. I don't usually talk, you all know that. So with diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging, I was curious, because at our city, for instance, what we do, and something that I've always been very interested in and engaged on, is we do a staff survey. I was just curious if we do that here at Nctd, and if so, like, I know retention and recruitment has been an issue for all the industries. And so from that perspective, if they feel a sense of belonging, if they feel happy with their job, and then fine tuning it based on feedback, because that also feeds into, what we oversee, right? So I'm just curious on that.
No, we don't have a practice of
Okay.
doing an annual survey when employees do leave. We do an offboarding survey from them to capture their feedback.
Okay. Just food for thought for my fellow members here. I think it's a really amazing tool. And if you look at something that the city of Carl's, like what we've put together, it really helps us understand, okay, why are people excited to be here? What's their purpose? What's their sense of belonging? Like, do they actually enjoy their job? And then like that culture aspect that we're talking about, like just ensuring that we have that culture that allows for them to thrive, whether it's professional development, whether it's, again, that DEI perspective, all those different things. So I just thought I'd bring that up, because I was thinking about it while we were talking about that. And I know for us, like, we've been able to see that people are happier because we're getting that feedback and then fine tuning based on that feedback that we receive every year. And then the last piece on community connection, I was just wanting to know, I know we do events internally from Nctd, and obviously involve the cities that we go through or involve, and so I was just wanting to know how else we are able to partner with the cities to maybe be present at some of the larger events, because we have other, obviously, folks that come out to like our concerts in the park. I'll use Carlsbad, for example. Again, that's that whole visibility and being seen as a leader in the community. So just curious if there's ways like I don't know, for kids to be interacting with, and then the parents come and have a conversation and we can do a survey or whatever else that might be.
Yeah,
So,
we've done that. And
Okay.
we continue to do that at fairs and other events where we'll have our pop-up tent and to engage with the community. But again, those are kind of things that we all could do more of.
Mhm.
And to the degree that, that cities have events and including us and reflecting us as part of the city and part of the region, that's kind of the force multiplier effect. Because I think kind of the thing is, a lot of times there's the thought processes of us standing out alone as if we're not an essential element of making cities successful, right? And the county successful. And so we need to work on how do we create that kind of seamless integration, and that this is part of our infrastructure or one of our
Mhm.
assets.
So is that our homework, that if there's
It's a-
something
it-
coming up, we can let you know?
Here's what the takeaway I think is going to be, that all of this is a collective effort,
Totally,
right?
Yeah.
And I would just say kind of like an overall theme of this is all of these things we have to put it in the context of what has happened over the last couple of years in terms of COVID, and then what's going to be the new normal and transitions. And I do think, one of the key things that we're going to do, I think that's a little bit more work, is that we do have a lot of reflection of input from our 810
Mhm.
employees, but we need to get a lot more feedback from frontline employees, whether or not they are our Nctd employees, because it has implications across DEI discussions, especially as it relates to equity. If you dig into details, you're going to hear a lot more if you're a white collar worker worrying about remote work as opposed to someone who has to be at work all of the time with a pretty locked and loaded schedule that says no matter what's going on in your life, you have to report on time and be ready for service. And I think that's one of the realms where we need to fine tune, because at the core of this organization is an operation, right? And frontline employees and customers. And there's always a tendency everywhere I've worked for us as administrative folks to become a little bit self-focused. And even boards can get self-focused around the whole notion of what an employee who works in the office as a core theme and what's important to the district, as opposed to the person who drives that bus, who's having to deal with all of the issues that go with driving a bus and engaging with customers that are meeting you at different points in their lives and different plights in their life. So the one true up for sure for this is making sure that we reflect at the core of this agency, from an employee point of view and organizing point of view, is supporting our frontline employees towards delivering the service. Right now, a lot of the feedback is more so of I'm in the office environment, and that thought process of promotion, this and that important. But the core of the organization, and if we ever lose sight of this, is our frontline employees and what they have to do and the sacrifices they have to make, I think, as evidence during the COVID-19.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I think definitely, I don't disagree with that fact. So I just want to say that, but I think, and maybe it isn't the frontline folks that would be at those types of events. I mean, going back to what the core of what I was talking about, because agree with you 100% that those folks, many of the folks throughout the pandemic that were out on the front lines, they were the ones that were making sure we could all function, right? However, to ensure that we still have that connectivity, that we're still seen as that leader, maybe that does fall on folks that are in the office, right? Like that they'll be the ones out in the field doing that work, so that frontline folks don't have to do that because they've already been doing, like you said, the harder work. So anyways, those are my thoughts, and I'll let somebody else take the mic, but just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Priya, just a note about, this reflects a moment in time, right? And we're in the midst of working the problem, right? And we're in the midst of the process. And so to the question, even about under this umbrella of community connection, when we land with specific objectives, and one of them might be we have an objective to build robust relationships with the cities in which we operate, to demonstrate to them the work that we do and make sure that they understand and feel like they have a voice in responding. We may decide to put together a working group that consists of people from cities as well as internal to the agency, external, to say, what's the best way to do this? And how do we create an actionable plan that serves the needs, right, of all of the stakeholders? And so that's kind of where we are right now. So I think that the questions are perfect, but we don't exactly have all of the answers yet because we haven't completed it. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Well, I think this is exciting because it's actually great timing because we're coming off of a very difficult 2.5 years. And in my mind, it's a step ahead
Mm.
we're a step ahead in the planning
Mm.
to get this moving. So I think that's kind of an exciting time.
Wonderful.
I have a couple questions. How many years since we done this? Has North County Transit ever done it
Yeah.
to
yes.
this extent? Okay,
Yeah, so we did do this when I arrived.
okay.
We went through a pretty extensive kind of update because remember, we were changing the business model dramatically. We did the update and then we were doing the tweaks around it. I would just tell you, literally a lot of the things are still core foundational
Right.
elements, but yeah, we do it. I would encourage that maybe every 10 years or so, or if you get to a seminal inflection point, like, a virus that shuts down the economy
Yeah,
and stuff like that.
So that was 13 years ago, I think.
It was about 12, 13
Well,
years.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think one of the things that I think this is all about what we were just talking about, but I just want to highlight it that I think we need to figure out what do we need to do to collaborate with the other regional players to make sure that we're working together to the best possible way for the whole county. And if that means somebody isn't working together well, what are we going to do about that? Because we want to move forward. We want to create this robust plan, this robust system. And sometimes you have some stumbling blocks in the way. And so what are we going to do with that so that everybody's focused on the same thing? Because the other players aren't doing this. So that would be one of my
That's
concerns.
so that's going to be how we focus because one of the number one things that I think as we go through this process, so there are going to be a lot of things that we already have top of mind that we want to do that we're going to have to, that we all agree we want to do it, but we can't say we're going to do 100 things, right?
Right.
What we're going to have to figure out is what are those priority things, and then we're going to have to work together that we're going to drive these things. The thing that I will tell you, it was a key example of how when we get focused, how we can get things done, was actually the funding for Delmar Bluffs 5 and 6. That came about because we were experiencing failures after failures after failures, and board chair at that time, Tony Krantz, called me. It's like, we got to do something. We got to get everyone focused. And so I said, okay. So we worked together. We convened that meeting at the Powerhouse. We got all of the elected officials there. It was on a weekend shutdown where we could actually take them out on the right of way. Now, that's the best example of when the board leads policymakers and walks them out that this is our problem, this is what we need to get done. We got the funding, and the project, is now just getting the project to construction. Those are the kind of things is that we need to really narrow down and focus. We could have 100 goals or activities we want to accomplish, but those key ones needs to be at the top of mind for the board. And the board needs to be working with us and driving that discussion and helping to knock down those barriers. If it's your city that has a beef that's impacting the project, then we need you to lead the way to help us collaborate. Yeah, to get past that issue. So I really do think it's narrowing down, and we're going to get there as we go through the process with Deloitte and through those areas of priority, to really allow the board to say, we're behind this and we're going to stay on top of it till it gets done.
I do think the comment about how to enhance the communication with the councils is a good idea. We've talked about it in the past. Because, and I like that staff, they send us 3 or 4 bullets. What are the highlights? What's the message we want you to give at council meeting? So that's really good. But I think sometimes council members will ask questions and we operate at such a higher level. We don't have sometimes those down in the weeds type answers right then. So I do like the idea of maybe, I don't know, once a year, not once a month, not once a week, not once a quarter, maybe once a year or twice a year, having somebody come that can take those questions and get them answered, I think is a great idea. We just had the County Water Authority come. Great dialogue and questions. That's the first time in my 10 years that I can remember that happening. So I do think that's a good idea. Yeah, that's all I had.
Thank you so much for the presentation and really a great launching point for us to figure out how, and I highlighted under the mission, user friendly, because that is absolutely necessary. I mean, I myself got stumbled in Solana Beach when I was on the wrong side of the tracks and I missed the train. And I was like, am I going to go back to Pizza Port? So, it's tangible things like wayfinding, right? Where I was like, oh, if I would have just looked at this map, I would have known I was on the wrong side, but I was trying to get some shade over here. And I was like, maybe this is the right side. So, and I see it, at the Vista Transit Center too. People are constantly asking me, hey, is this the right side to, go to Escondido or to go to Oceanside? So I think that's critical. And I feel like we have to get moving faster and making it easier for people to understand how to utilize our system. But this is such great information. I mean, I have so many like random notes on here. But I wanted to, say that I'm really sad that my mayor from the city of Vista didn't participate in this. The city of Vista, our median age is 31.9. We have a very young city. My district is, District 1 is even younger than that. So it's and I see a ton of people utilizing public transit, including myself, from the Vista Transit Center. So, one of the things that I want to say is, I like the idea, Matt, of how you said, hey, we took all the elected officials to Del Mar. Do we do any workshops directly at transit centers?
No, we have not done it.
Because I'm going to say, let's just have a workshop at a transit center.
Well, we had some discussion, so not at a transit center, but some time ago, I had opened a discussion if we wanted to do kind of roving board meetings and rotating and move them around just a little bit. And yeah, that is a little bit stressful for staff, and sometimes intrusive on the cities in terms of timing. But I really do think if we want to do outreach to people, then we need to try to meet them where they are, having even the focus events at a station to highlight something. Like I know we're all tied closely on Buena Creek and grade separation, sprinter improvements. That's one of those things. If you can get close enough to people, it's like the Del Mar Bluffs, that if you see what we're talking about,
Right,
you go like, Shazam, we need to do something about it. But all of those things are part of different strategies that we can employ as we look at how do we get things done, to highlight one, that we're collaborating and that it's not about Nctd. It's because that's kind of the issue. Shouldn't be about the city, shouldn't be about Nctd. It should be about our residents and uplifting our residents. And so I think this is, again, a partnering activity for everyone who's serious about making progress, to engage together to create that success, because we can't do it alone. We have to have other partners who are equally committed to achieving that success.
Yeah, I mean, I see in my mind just a pop-up at, we have, 2 parking lots, but one of them is right connected to, and I'm going to use the Vista Transit Center because I'm so, there all the time. I feel like I live there. Um, and, just having a pop-up and being able to get more stakeholder broad perspectives, right? And bilingual perspectives, different age groups. I mean, I see everybody from our Youth Opportunity Pass folks to, our seniors that are trying to get to different places. So I just want to put a plug in for that. I will third the once or twice a year to council as a presentation. I think that's great. I certainly, while I'm on council, there's always an invite. And for right now in the city of Vista, it only takes one council member to put a presentation on the agenda. So until they take that away from me, you're welcome. And let's see here. I wanted to talk a little bit too about microtransit. So this is something that I've brought recently to my city manager, trying to really take inventory of the speeds of our roads, because when we're looking at NEVs, right, the neighborhood electric vehicles or the LSVs, the low speed vehicles, which are legal in California and would be a great way to do microtransit, not all of our roads are 35 miles per hour or less. So that is a constraint there. And then we know too that anything that's more than 35 miles per hour is actually dangerous. So, trying to look at what cities can do from an infrastructure perspective to really allow for different types of microtransit to move forward. I would love for that to be part of what we're discussing, because if we want the proliferation of connecting folks from the first and last mile to, fixed rail or bus stop or something like that, I think microtransit using NEVs and LSVs is really important. If we do our mission right, the byproduct is we reduce VMTs, we reduce GHGs, and we have more flexible and reliable connectivity for our residents throughout the region. Another thing that I highlighted here, I put little stars next to special workshops. So I'm all about workshops. I think, gives us a great amount of flexibility to kind of dive deeper into conversations. I know we have constraints during board meetings. And then when it comes to active collaboration, I'll use again my city because I'm most familiar with it, but we have a business park. Areas where there's a high concentration of employees from different industries, whether that's in Vista or, I know Carlsbad right next door. You all have like a great business center. I want to make sure that we're able to provide flexibility and connectivity to those folks as well and get their perspectives. And then kind of launching off from that, housing and transportation are going to be hand in hand. We new state guidelines, we're going to become way more dense in transit oriented development. So being able to, again, look at our city infrastructures, our respective cities, really push for the ability to create connectivity between different transit systems, whether it's the bus, microtransit, fixed rail. But we're going to need to do it. Right? We need to be also able to connect people that are on e-bikes to our different modes of transportation. I keep seeing that more and more. So, connectivity, user friendly, right? Getting different perspectives. I love Priya's idea of, I want to second that on DEIB. For our coworkers here at Nctd to really get their feedback. I think that's a great practice. It's something that only good can come from it. So let's see if I have any other scribbles here. I think that's it for me for now. The last thing I want to say that I think it's incredible that we had 120 employees participate, and our mission will not be successful if we don't have operators. And I know that I'll keep it very brief because it might be off topic, but I know that, in previous meetings, we've talked about increasing the compensation package. But if you look at AMI categories here in San Diego, that's still at a very low income. So I think that if we want to expand ridership, we need to be able to expand our workforce on bus operators. And I will say that I am 100% in favor of looking at land that we own to make sure that, we can have maybe rolled up in a compensation package, after a certain amount of years, maybe you can apply for affordable housing or whatever the case might be. Because I worry that we're not going to be able to get enough operators to deliver on our mission. But that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karina and Sharon and Priya. Lots of good comments. Let's see, where do I start? So I definitely agree. You've got 4 out of 4 regarding presentations. Like, please come and talk at our city councils. Presentations. You're welcome. Yes. Presentations are, I already had, that's why I thought she was copying my note, or, I was like, quit looking at my paper. Presentations are at the beginning of our meetings, right? I don't know about you guys, but when we report out, it's at the end of the meeting. We're tired. Our fellow council members are packing up, staff's packing up. And if there were members of the public present, they're long gone. So I can speak all I want about what we're doing at that time, but if no one's listening, it doesn't help. So, a combination of maybe having you once or twice a year. Sandak stops by that often, whenever they want.
If Sandak can do it, we can.
Exactly. I was putting, it's like competition here. But announcements. So maybe if marketing puts together something once a month or twice a month that is like a few bullets about announcements that we may have forgotten, or you really want to highlight in the community. Announcements for us, or at least for me, come at the beginning of the meeting. The mayor does her announcement, says, does anybody else have any announcements? And I go, hey, free ride day. I usually, roll something out, but I don't always have something to roll out. So if I do, it's more likely to get out there. Culture aspect, let's see. I think it's a great idea to have as much employee feedback as possible, because we do want employees engaged and really feeling like they're part of what's happening here and that they're being heard. Whether it's a survey that's once or twice a year or something like that, or a suggestion box, or old school suggestion box, right? I mean, they work. Because sometimes those things are just, someone has a great idea because they're experiencing it, and it's like, boom, write it down. Community engagement. Yes, yes, yes. I think that we should be doing a pop-up at a transit station once a week or once a month somewhere, right? Chris, get out there with your marketing crew. Get out there, give away hats and, give away whatever. But the public needs to see you, and they need to be able to ask questions, right? We're just this agency, and they don't put a face on it. So I think it's important to have cheerleaders out there, talking about what it is that Nctd is doing that people may not know about, or having the presence to answer questions for people who may have some. And proactive people who are like Girl Scouts selling cookies at the door, who really will engage people when they walk by, not let them come up and say hi. It's like, hey, did you know about, what we're doing? This is all exciting, and share stuff with people. And like we had free ride to work day, right? And we received an email that was distributed today, and it was interesting. So when I was yesterday down at Old Town, when we were doing the press conference, I heard MTS say, oh yes, and we're going to have ambassadors at the different stations, and we'll be giving away goodies, and we'll be, there present for people to help direct them with wayfinding and stuff. And I thought, are we doing that? And it sounds from that email like we weren't doing that, and maybe we should have done that. So maybe that's something we can do in the future. And gosh, we have ride to work day, free ride to work day. There's bike to work day in May. Why don't we have a bus to work day or a roll to work day, that we declare it's ours, right? We own it. Don't let MTS do it first. We want to have something. Let's see, microtransit. Yes. Great comments regarding working with the cities. I know in my city, most places it is 35, but there are some 40-mile-an-hour zones, and that's working with staff, but it's also those higher above us at the federal level set the what we need to do in order to lower speed limits, right? So we can't always actually control that. So maybe that's someplace where we reach out legislatively to be able to make these last mile solutions work. If traffic's moving too fast and we can't utilize the vehicles that we need, we're kind of shot down from the beginning. So that's a legislative thing, in my opinion. So lastly, e-bikes. Can you put them on the coaster?
Can we? I'll be looking to that.
Can you put them on the Sprinter? Okay, and can you put them on the Sprinter?
Yes.
Okay, and can you put them on a bus?
Depends on the tire size.
Mostly no? Okay, because somebody asked me that question, and I said, I thought pretty much,
Regular size tire, yes. That's fat tires, no.
okay,
So a
So-
mountain bike tire, yes. Really big beachcomber tires, no.
okay. Well, that's not going to be an easy answer for people. But thank you, I appreciate that. And so if I have a question about certain routes, I will reach out to you and ask.
Well,
Awesome.
and I will just tell you on that one, the reason he's so conversant, because Karina, Karina pinged me, I think it was like less than 30 days ago, and we are looking at the different bike racks and what may become available in the future, what's available. All of it's complex, but I will say this in general, all of you guys, this discussion are really things that are that fall really within our service planning and service development activities, where there is like significant and detailed work already underway and rollout plans, like microtransit. We've received proposal for the app, and we'll be coming to the board in a couple of months about the app. When it comes to speed, remember we did the breeze, speed and reliability, focused in on how can we improve the speed, use of technology, infrastructure improvements. So there was not a topic that was discussed from a service quality, which is a great thing, which is the bread and butter, and even the housing, everyone knows what we're doing. But I think part of this is one of the things that I worry most about for our industry is being able to meet the moment at the right time. And I think we're going to have to work well with Chris and team as we do this to really highlight these activities and put schedules, and then work one across all of Nctd and with our key stakeholders about implementation. Because if I talk to you about microtransit for 10 years, at some point it no longer becomes an important thought process for you. Business cycle may have changed, life circumstances may have changed, a pandemic might have forced us into a different area, whatever. And so I think one of the key pieces is, again, going to be the focus on priorities and executing those priorities so that people can see tangible change rather than hearing us talk about that it's underway. So it's going to be lots of robust discussions at MISBDA. I know the chair of NISBA has asked us to have increased meetings, and I know we have worked that out to have that increased discussions at meeting frequency. And I do think report out to even with our board, and then making more of these priorities and activities are underway more top of mind will help board members, because if we can lay this out better so that you can see what's the schedule of these things that are very simplified, non-jumbo thing, it would really help you focus on, like, I got 5 things, Matt, where are these 5 things at right now?
Priya, go ahead.
If I could just add to the NISBA really quick. While you were chatting, Jewel, and I was just thinking, is there a way that, and you don't have to answer it now, that you could share like social media packages with your board members so we could roll stuff out? Because otherwise we're retweeting and quote tweeting or whatever else that we're
Absolutely.
posting. But if you just send it to us and you say, hey, this is approved for you to post, and this is variations of text that you can use to like put out there. I mean, we all have our own followers for our own cities. Like, we can at least amplify some of the messaging. Obviously, we amplify what we can, but I think just being able to do it on our own and like adding our own flavor a little bit to it will help. And then
love
the
it.
other piece, like for the younger demographic, I'm terrible at TikTok, but maybe for Nctd to think about that, because the city just started doing that, for instance, just to reach different folks. And then the other piece was around, getting us to do videos for certain days, like, having us like, hey, like, for instance, if Karina's taking, transit, like, hey, I'm on transit, like doing this, like, this is where I'm going, this is where you can get off to do whatever, like, even if it's just like something to show that your board members are actively engaged in some of these things. I think it just allows for it to humanize it a bit more versus just like pictures of buses or whatever else,
Totally agree. Totally agree. And I'm sure
So-
Chris is taking all of these notes down, and we're going to be packaging you up.
Great, perfect.
Awesome. Well,
TikTok.
so that was a wonderful discussion. Lori, thank you for the presentation. Appreciate all of staff's efforts on this. And this was purely an informational item, so we of course aren't going to vote on it. Next on the agenda is an update on the annual review of and proposed modifications of Nctd board policies. Lori A. Winfrey, General Counsel, will now review agenda item 2.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Needs to have. Okay. All right. Okay, so in accordance with board policy number 1, staff is required to look at the board policies on an annual basis and determine whether there's modifications that need to be made. Sometimes they're administrative in nature, sometimes regulatory, and sometimes they're brand new, and we want to request of the board to adopt a new policy. Next slide. This is a list of some of the non-substantive revisions that we're requesting that the board make, and all of them are administrative in nature. I've put some comments there. I don't think we need to go through them. Conflict of interest code, for example, we just updated designated positions. Cash reserves, we just updated the deductibles. Record retention schedule, which is formatting, and so forth. So I won't go through them each one by one, but these were very administrative in nature and no substantive changes. Next slide. Same here, position title updates and things of that nature. So we have 4 board policies that I want to talk about today that did have substantive changes that we're requesting of the board. Most of these were administrative in nature in some respects. They weren't, regulatory or legal, but we thought they were important for the board to consider as we move into the next year. Next slide. All right, so the first one is board policy number 5, is public notice and participation. We've just added a section here to add in Senate Bill 1100. It was signed into law and goes into effect on January 1 of next year. And this Senate bill really just codified practice that had already been codified in case law and things of that nature. But now it's actually a statute in the state of California. And it authorizes a governing body like the Nctd board to warn a public speaker of their disruptive behavior and subsequently to have them removed if they don't comply. You were already able to do that, but it had not been codified in law, and now it is. So this is the only substantive change to board policy number 5. So we're ready for January 1. All right, board policy 19. This is the delegation of authority to the executive director. The only substantive change here is to request of the executive committee to consider advancing to the full board this recommendation to increase the simplified procurement threshold in terms of Matt's authority for executing contracts. We had, if you might remember, we had some legislative changes to our contracting authority. Previously, our simplified procurement threshold was $100,000, and the board had doubled that to $200,000 for Matt's authority. Now the simplified threshold under the new contracting authority is $150,000, and we thought it might be prudent to double that as we did previously to $300,000, so that we can avoid bringing every single contract action to the board that the legislative authority already provides for. Next slide, please. Board policy 21. This is related to complementary ADA paratransit program. Some of you here, I think, Priya, particularly board member Bhat Patel, we've had a lot of communications related to customers who are living in what we call these, kind of bigger donut hole areas in the paratransit service area. Under the federal statute, we're only obligated to provide service inside this 3/4 of a mile corridor around our fixed route services. However, the board, I believe it was last year, had modified the policy to allow us to fill in some of the very small, what we call donut holes, where there was service continuously around these small holes in a 1 square mile area. So that was adopted by the board last year. What we're asking now, we've done some analysis, and I think I do have, I have Damon Blythe here if you have specific questions, but we've done some analysis around this in terms of the cost for this service, considered whether or not a premium fare would be, applicable to this area. And having done that analysis, we believe that we should just service those areas without additional fare. And so this is the request at this time. This is an item that we intend to take on other business to the October board meeting. And so we want to have a discussion here at the executive committee about that proposed change. Next slide. Okay. Board policy number 24. This is the employee drug and alcohol policy. This is obviously a required board policy adoption in relation to our federal funding. We just added a section identifying Nctd as a drug-free workplace. Obviously, it already was, and we had this policy statement in other places, but it hadn't been put in the board policy. And that was some of the feedback that we received from the FTA in our triennial review was it would be nice to see this in the policy adopted by the board. So we've added that. And then as it relates to the second element, currently the board policy allows for employees to self-report addiction issues as long as they have not popped for a drug test or they have not already violated the policy. We have determined that administration of that return to work program is very, very complicated, and it places a lot of liability on Nctd in terms of making determinations as to whether someone is able and eligible to return to the workforce. And so we would like to remove the self-reporting elements of the policy and strictly comply with the law as it requires us to do, which is the random testing and things of that nature, in which case there is, a very specific framework under the law as to how to address those, rather than Nctd independently administrating a return to work program. And with that, I think we should have a discussion, but assuming that the executive committee authorizes the advancement of these proposed modifications, these would go to the October regular board meeting. All of them are intended to go on consent, assuming executive committee, I'm about to get there, assuming that the executive committee approves, with the exception of board policy 21, which is the complementary paratransit item. All right, and with that, I will take any questions, and I have a panel here to discuss any substantive questions.
Well, before we move to questions, just let me ask Suhail, do we have any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. The time has ended to speak on this item for the public. So we will move to board questions. I see Priya's hand up. Should we let her go first again? Sure. Okay, no, I'm gonna go in reverse order. Sharon, you start. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just have a procedural question. If I remember correctly, I think you periodically review all of the policies. Do you have a pattern that you go through of selecting them, or do you only select ones that you have a concern on at that point in time?
We review all of the board policies on an annual basis. And so actually CPL, as the board clerk, she's responsible for disseminating those amongst staff. We look at every single one of them.
Oh, every
to make
year.
sure- Yes.
Every year,
Yeah,
okay.
to make sure there's no legal
Okay.
updates or regulatory updates. And in this case, if there's any policy changes that we'd like to request. to the board.
Okay, I didn't know they were annual. Okay, that was it. Thanks.
Karina, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, you know what? I have a question on board policy number 19 and the increase. Is that simply because the cost of doing business is so much higher?
I would say more so is the amount of work that it takes to get a thing on an agenda item and then the schedule impacts to project. You know, it's one of the challenges that we were talking about in the strategic about how do we move from when we have the right thing or the good thing or the practical or the thing that we got to do to implementation as quickly as possible. All of these things are probably low. They are all typically low risk items for the district. And the way that we manage the transparency with the board is that we have a quarterly report that summarizes all of the activities that are not done by me. I'm not doing all of that work, that are done under the authority granted to me by the board. So it's really, from my point of view, primarily the efficiency of advancing work for the district in a more timely manner.
And are these increases sufficient given inflation and whatnot? I mean, yeah,
So
I feel like it's actually kind of low.
it's probably one of those good, better, best. And that's one of the things that we say. It is low. What we could do, and I wouldn't propose making a change between now and the next board meeting, is next year, once this goes in place, we would do that analysis as part of this update to see, you know, what number makes sense and provide a little bit tangible example of how we came up with that line. You know, typically this is one of those things, depending upon what's the board's appetite for, you know, activity. There are lots of procurement items that go on the board agenda every month. Most of those things you see are going like kind of perfunctory, transactional things that we have to do, and the more significant ones that are like the bus purchases, you know, they plop up and they are going to always be on the contract in terms of the more significant expenditures. So definitely we're on the low end, but this is definitely better than where we are today.
Right. And because this isn't tied to CPI or what's the other one, CCI. So
I'm sorry, I can
Yeah.
add
Yes,
a little bit
please.
to this. My name is Julie Wiley. I'm the Chief of Procurement here at Nctd. I actually worked on this legislation, AB 1833, when I was at Sandag. And what the legislation's goal was to attach the rates for Sandag, MTS, and Nctd to the OMB circular for what is considered simplified procurement, because it is adjusted based on CPI on a regular basis. And the threshold for FTA under that OMB circular, and that applies to recipients like Nctd, is actually $250,000 for simplified procurement threshold instead of the 100 or the 150 that we'll be moving to. They were ambivalent at the legislative level, the Republicans in particular, about giving smaller agencies as much authority as the federal agencies will allow. But there is an intent to go back to the legislature again, because even if they're going to keep it as a lower limit, we do want still to have CPI or some other index attached to the number, so that we don't have to keep coming back to the legislature for an increase every time there's a big change in the marketplace. That is the goal for this next legislative session, is to go back again for all three agencies and ask for something that's tied to an index.
Great. Yeah. I just feel like these limits are still too low.
Yeah.
That's my, that's my comment, but that's all I have. I mean, I think everything is good to go from my perspective. Except for this, I would like to see our limits increase a little bit more.
Priya? Oh, wait, did you have a?
I had just one more question. Lori, why would we not be able to increase this limit today if it's not?
In terms of Matt's authority?
Yeah,
So the authority for contracting is set in the legislature, right? Like,
okay, this is the max? I thought it was slightly higher.
Yeah.
I'm
no, the
confused. It is
max-
higher.
Well, the max under state law is different than the max under federal law, correct?
Correct. Our state legislation limits how we do procurement, but as far as being tied to Matt's delegation of
Exactly.
authority, that could be modified in the board policy, yes,
Yeah.
to an
Yeah,
increased
so
amount.
Matt's authority could be modified by this board policy. So Matt could have authority, let's say if the board decided we prefer not to see anything that's less than $500,000 except on a quarterly report, you could do that. But our contracting authority would not change.
Right.
Only Matt's authority to approve items before reporting to the board.
Which still has that benefit of reducing the
Right.
project
Right,
schedule time for us to advance something to.
right. I just feel like if we're reviewing this and we feel like that it's lower, it just seems like, why wait another year? Why not just, if it's gonna make it easier for staff and we're gonna get the reports anyway, I just.
Well, I think it's October, so we're talking about waiting a couple of months at this point, right?
So
To come
based on
back.
the feedback that you're saying, we will revise our recommendation for the meeting to a higher number.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Yeah.
I like that.
That seemed to be the group consensus. Thank
Are-
you for
are-
all of that
yeah.
great information, Julie.
Just,
and for
I'm
the good
curious, is
questions.
500,000 the amount you'd like to propose?
Karina?
That's actually the amount I was thinking in my head. I didn't know if there's an appetite for that with the rest of the board members, but just seeing as how expensive some of these things are. And we really, as a board, want to be able to focus on these bigger issues. I'm 100% okay with 500,000.
I would be too.
Me too.
Yes. So you've got 4 out of 4 executive committee members who suggest that we,
Make that modification for the action board consideration.
all right. Priya, it's your turn now.
Thank you. So I'll start off with the first one, which is under board policy number 5. Just a quick question. In terms of disruptive, did they also define what that means, or is it going to be subjective based on what we particularly feel? I mean, it hasn't happened, at least in my time here, definitely happened on my city council, but just curious what we would define as disruptive.
I think that is subjective. And I think you'll know it when you see it, I think is the best way to describe it right now. It's not defined presently.
And I know, during COVID, we ended up having to, for instance, not just around just public decorum, but it was like for everyone to kind of abide by some sort of code of conduct. We display it at every meeting now as people are walking in. It's like to create a respectful, I mean, obviously, again, it hasn't happened here, but I'm just thinking from a proactive standpoint, as we put this together, as we start to move forward, we're back in person, more people start coming back in. Just wanted to throw that out there as something that I know our city has done, is to make sure that we read it out in the beginning of the meeting to let folks know, hey, like, this is how we conduct ourselves, like, you can respectfully get your point across, and just keeping in mind that when you're there, that you are speaking to the public. And so I think we just wanted to throw that out there. And I know I'm sure our city attorney would be happy to share what we have. So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah.
Is that something that your mayor reads or that your clerk reads or?
The mayor reads it at the
I
beginning.
was hoping it was going to be the clerk.
You could change it. You can change it. We just have the mayor do it just because he's, conducting the meeting.
Already
We don't
started, yeah.
typically have the clerk read it, yeah. I think it's really just up to whoever, what we want to do, but I just think it's a great way to set the tone. And also, I just feel like, in this climate, it's so important for us to be able to do business and do it in a way where we can actually respectfully do business, so I just wanted to bring that up. With the ADA piece, I know it does impact areas in my city. Of course, we're talking about doing so. It says complimentary, so I just wanted to ask like the fiscal impact of that, if we have that just from a board perspective.
Yeah, so the fiscal impact, we anticipate it's going to be about $98,000 a year. I have the exact number in the report. I'd have to dig it out, but that's the additional cost of us going into those additional areas based on the level of, or the number of trips taken by existing customers and predicted future customers.
Great, thank you. And I know I can definitely say thank you on behalf of the folks that I've received communications from. I'm sure this will be really helpful. So yeah, with that.
Great. With that ADA paratransit donut hole filling, is there a map that you can share with us so that we can look on our individual cities, if people have reached out to us and say, hey, guess what?
We can make that available. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. We don't want to wait for them to have to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
Nice to see that we're doing proactive things that benefit them. I'm good with everything else. The questions that were asked were pretty much the same questions I would have asked. And all right. So let's see, where are we now? Again, informational only. We don't have a vote, but we did give direction. The final item on today's open session portion of the agenda is a review of the proposed calendar year 2023 legislative agenda. Mary Drover, our governmental affairs officer, will now review item number 3.
Good afternoon, board members. As Chair Edson said, I am Mary Dover, the new government affairs officer. Met most of you in person, but it's nice to see you here. Please. By way of background, every year Nctd's board of directors is asked to approve a legislative agenda, and this legislative agenda guides Nctd's legislative activity at all levels, federal, state, and local. Next slide, please. The existing legislative platform, an overview. We, myself and Chris, track legislation internally that impacts Nctd in concert with our legislative consultant partners. We also attend monthly meetings of regional government affairs counterparts from SANDAG, MTS, the City of San Diego Chamber, any entity really that has a focus on transportation. We also participate in the American Public Transit Association's, APTA's Legislative Advocacy Day that they do probably more than once a year. There's only been one this year that I know of, but also the California Transit Association's federal and state legislative committees. Those meet 2 times a month. And we also attend federal and state legislative conferences, whether they are put on by APTA or CTA. And to summarize all of this, we provide the board with monthly intergovernmental affairs reports and tracked legislation reports that note the impact to Nctd of particular pieces of legislation, actions that have been taken on the legislation, and a brief summary of the legislation. Next slide, please. The last time the board was asked to approve a legislative agenda was in February of this year for the calendar year 2022 legislative agenda. The reason why we're bringing it to you a little bit earlier this year is so that we can get out ahead of the future legislative cycle. I'll mention dates later on in the presentation, but I wanted to highlight some of the changes. There aren't a ton from calendar year 2022 to 2023. We added 2 provisions, 4th from the bottom, to support legislation that assists Nctd in streamlining construction processes. This was born out of a piece of legislation that was passed this cycle in the state legislature that extended a CEQA exemption And this provision will afford us with the opportunity to support any future exemptions or any other actions taken at the state level or the federal level to streamline construction processes. And similar to that, we added a provision, the one below it, support legislation that provides cost savings on vehicle procurements or construction projects. Similar situation, the California State Legislature passed a bill to extend a sales tax exemption for zero emission buses. And so this provision will allow us to support future proposals at the state or federal level that might do similar things. And then on the second page, we added second from the top, support proposals that reconsider the use of the fare box recovery ratio as a metric for state funding eligibility. This will provide Nctd with a little bit more flexibility to for reduced or zero fare programs and have that have less of an impact on state reporting requirements. We did keep a lot of the provisions in the legislative agenda this year. As Julie mentioned, although we did have legislative successes, there is still room for growth on some of the things that we have been working on. We're always going to support increased funding for transit programs. And we also, as Julie mentioned, would ideally love to see the procurement thresholds be tied to CPI. Next slide, please, Sunil. So kind of an overview of the previous legislative activity that we were able to conduct since the board passed the calendar year 2022 legislative agenda. Nctd staff was able to participate in the APTA Legislative Advocacy Day to support increased and full funding for public transportation programs that were authorized by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That could be seen as a success. They were authorized to their levels that were appropriate, or they were appropriated to the levels authorized in the Infrastructure Investment Act, and in some instances exceeded what was authorized. Nctd also was able to secure $7 million in community project funding from Congressman Levin to advance the Sprinter signal modernization aspect of the Sprinter Corridor Service Improvement Project. The House did pass their version of that bill in July, but the Senate must pass their version. They must be conferenced, and then they have to be signed by President Biden before we can actually receive the $7 million. Congress just passed what's called a continuing resolution to just continue funding levels. And then to give them more time to pass what's called an omnibus spending bill that includes the $7 million that Nctd would receive. Slide, please. And then I won't touch too much on this because Lori and Julie covered most of it already, but Nctd sponsored AB 1833 and Julie had a hand in writing to increase the procurement thresholds. It was amended from what was originally proposed to take out the CPI provision. So we'll go back to the legislature next year for that. So the dates that I mentioned, the reason why we're bringing this to you earlier is because the California legislature and the US Congress usually reconvene January 3rd or 4th. And then at the state level, assembly members and state senators have only until about mid-February to introduce pieces of legislation. So if we would like them to author a specific piece of legislation, we need to get it done pretty quickly. And then at the federal level, the next fiscal year 2024 appropriations process usually begins in March. That's when the earmark process will begin and Nctd can support and advance our funding priorities. So with that, I'm open to any questions and feedback regarding the legislative agenda. This will be presented to the full board at the October 20th meeting.
Thank you, Sahil. Do we have any public speakers on this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, at this time, public registration to speak on this item has ended. Do any board members have any questions or comments? Yes. Okay, I'm going to start with Karina. I'm doing round robin.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And I do have a question or two. When we're looking at zero emission buses, trains, is that are we trying to electrify the trains?
Yeah. So we are actively working on the transition of the rail fleet. to zero emission trains. And we just finished attending a conference where we actually saw lots of different examples of different propulsion technologies that are zero emission. And so, yeah, that's one of our focus goals. We have a dedicated staff person who's that's working to help us work through it. Just keeping in mind, this is exceedingly early, in the game of the transition. But the good news to note is that our rail lines have been identified pretty much by every vendor as the best lines for an initial rollout of whatever technology you would want to roll out.
That's great, because I think recently we had was it the Sprinter that had a fuel leak?
That was, yeah, but that was something else.
Oh, okay. But if we had an electrified Sprinter, then would there still be the possibility for a fuel leak? I don't know the technology
No,
at
that
all.
would, if you had a hybrid, and so to give you an example,
So it's like a Prius.
Yeah. Well, you could have a hybrid where it's fuel and battery or some other propulsion. It could be hydrogen. So without turning this into a vehicle discussion, we're looking right now with the Sprinter. Our Siemens, our vendor, is we saw that the Indian manufacturer for the Sprinter has a concept design for a zero emission power pack that would be battery, and that if we likely were able to install some form of charge, it could be a limited catenary at a couple of stations and a couple of midpoints, or embedded in track or plug in, would likely work, assuming and a bunch of different things. But we're working towards engagement with that vendor to see if the feasibility of implementing that on our fleet, doing one vehicle, upgrading that vehicle, because it's a similar discussion about the long-term life of that vehicle. As it relates to the coaster fleet, we are looking at potentially, assuming board approval and a bunch of other stuff, selling one of our tier 4 locomotives, because we have 4 coming, 2 of them, those are locally funded, to support the purchase of a zero emission locomotive. Hopefully that could be delivered in the next 3 to 5 years, worst case scenario, to be placed in revenue service. And then, assuming a bunch of other different things, it would allow us to transition our fleet over time to zero emission. And again, that would, if it's battery, is likely a limited catenary, not like full MTS, but limited catenary plus charging to support that kind of activity. High priority for us.
Wow, that's
And-
incredible.
To put it in the legislative context, the California Air Resources Board is in the process of developing a regulation that would require agencies to transition their fleets to zero emission. We're working with the other commuter rail agencies to emphasize that the technology does exist in some forms, largely not commercially available. And so it's definitely a goal of ours, but there will be some challenges.
That's great. And just a quick follow up on that. What about the freight that goes like BSNF?
So BNSF actually is working on that. In fact, the entire rail industry. In fact, one of the presentations I received was from a manufacturer that's building trains for the private rail industry. Right now, a lot of that is trying to reduce fuel consumption. So you put a battery powered locomotive in with a diesel locomotive, and you reduce the amount of fuel consumption, and you may try to use that to get through certain areas. But that's the original plan, but also like yard movement and activities, converting a lot more of that movement to zero emission type of support technologies. BNSF just released a communication highlighting a project that they're trying to do up in Barstow, which is a significant expansion and reorganization of an intermodal facility. Part of that includes, and those are the discussions that Nctd and BNSF have been having, that form lots of our partnerships and collaboration about the convention center platform and work down south, is really pointing towards how do we implement context sensitive rail operations that's consistent with the expectation that passenger and freight rail grow over time.
Awesome. That's great. And my last question is just if you could go over a little bit of the fare box recovery, because I know it's like a
Yeah.
huge
I'm gonna hand that to
issue.
Matt.
Thanks.
Yeah,
That's
you
my
wanna do that one?
last question on this one, but
So as we sit today, you have the state law that mandates specific targets related to fare box recovery. And for NCTD, the blended number, I believe, was 18.8%. One of the things that, has been discussed at the state level for a significant period of time, and the discussions have continued to go about reform from STA, TDA reform. The notion that we're bringing up here is, if you would want us to do, for example, free fares, then that directly impacts fare box recovery. And so you can't have a metric that is diametrically opposed to the public policy position that you're articulating for us to follow. We have been, I can say it with confidence, the leader in the state on this issue, because we learned a lesson some time ago, and it was well before pre-COVID. We implemented a reduced fare on the Sprinter where we subsidized the fare. We got the benefit of the increased ridership, but the fare box recovery went down because we had a dedicated source of funding that was using to fund it, but that was not customer revenue. So you have to also understand the accounting element of this. So let's say in a particular case of Sandag and their funding, the youth fare program is coming from CMAQ funding, which is federal dollars, congestion mitigation for air quality improvement funds. So when you use that money, it's not customer revenue. Right. So that means you've lost that customer revenue and your fare box recovery number goes down. So the intent here is, let's true up public policy with public policy expectations.
awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I have a few questions, so it might take a little bit of time. So really quick, this one's quick. So I'm looking at, the discretionary grant funding for capital projects, and obviously not limited to, I didn't see the trenching for Carlsbad. And I know that's something that's been in the pipeline for a while. Just curious if that's still something that's on the list, but just not presented here.
That's one of the instances. A lot of our discretionary grant activity is done in collaboration with Sandag. It is a Sandag project. It's important to Nctd, but it is in the pipeline of projects that are on our radar. It's just, not one of the ones mentioned here.
I think what Mary also is getting, it's a project that we support, but it's not a project that we are directly leading, managing, and advancing the funding, seeking the funding on. So you wouldn't see that project as a project in our discretionary grant program, because we're not the one leading the charge for that one.
So I get that. And then just to clarify, and then I'll go into my other questions, and maybe it's an off this conversation, but quickly, from what I understand, all three agencies would be pitching in, right? So isn't there a way, are we waiting for Sandag to give us the light in order to be like, okay, now we need to go look out for funding as well?
So there's the confusion about all three agencies pitching in. There has never been a discussion where NCTD had committing any funding. I do understand that double tracking in Carlsbad, it was part of the RTP, and there were certain cost assumptions made. And my understanding was that Sandag was essentially proffering to the city that those dollars, and again, this was years ago, would be dollars that they could expect as dollars that would be contributed towards a project. But then the city of Carlsbad, because this would be considered a betterment, would be responsible for working with other stakeholders to identify the costs, the added costs associated with getting that project implemented.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I can talk to you offline.
Yes,
So I'm
ma'am.
not spending this much time on that. And then, so really quickly, I'm just curious. I know we're part of a lot of different organizations, entities with regards to transportation. It sounds like, we're part of American Public Transit Association, California Transit Association, et cetera. One of the things, and this might not be directly related, I was curious about was if we've ever been a part of the League of Cities, because obviously many of us are on there and there's a lot of work that's being done, whether it's staff that's part of it or whatever else, that We all sit on many policy committees where there are impacts, obviously, not only to our cities, but I think our agencies as well with regards to legislation. And then all of us are obviously advocating for legislation. And it's just a great convening space to not only have North County electeds advocating for something, but also have others understand why it would impact them as well. So just curious if that's something that could be in the pipeline for wanting to have somebody show up there.
Yeah, so historically, we haven't done a lot, but we could. I know for APTA does
Of course. yeah.
a lot of that with the League of Cities, and I know they even make presentations
Yeah.
at the national meeting to kind of create that collaboration. But certainly, we're more than willing to sit
Okay.
at that table.
No, the only reason why I mentioned that is I think so I'll be the president of this year and the chair for TC Transportation Communications and Public Works. And the reason why I'm thinking is, okay, is there a way that we have the ability to just like, really bring all the different agencies that are working with us to ensure, and I'm hoping as not on this level, but like as the president, really being very active on doing a lot of the advocacy for legislation, because we get updates, but I want to make sure we're actually going out and doing advocacy work. And so I think that's something that I'd love to hope that, as NCTD, again, being seen as that leader, like I'm thinking that it would be helpful. And I obviously leave it up to your discretion on what you think is best. Moving into some of the legislation, I hear, and it sounds like I had jotted down sustainability ? And I obviously saw a couple of items here that talk about zero emission buses, trains, and other things. Are there other pieces of legislation from a sustainability perspective that we're planning on advocating for?
Well, I would not say at this point that we have that well defined. We are in the process of doing a climate action plan. I think that's out for bidding, or I think proposals may be due already on that. But at this point, the primary focus has been that whole transition to zero emissions. And from a state level, whether it be from a vehicle point of view or infrastructure and projects, there's a lot of supporting language and legislation that's flowing with it. But I'm sure as we go through and complete the number of studies that we have underway, I can give you an example of something that I do think that the board should take a lead on, is asking consideration at the state level for consideration from these school districts and how they choose to locate and construct middle and high schools. That is like the bane of our existence, that nobody cares what we have to say in advance of them choosing to build it. And then when they build it somewhere that we can't make a left or right turn with the bus, then we get all of the negative feedback and the expectation that we figure out how to provide service. That would be an area around sustainability, ridership development, that I think is a critical element for us to weigh in. Won't see immediate benefit, but the long-term of changing that arc of how those projects are pretty significant, I think, for all transit agencies across the state.
Okay. Yeah. And I think just like, I love that there's a climate action plan in the works. Would love to hear when that's coming to us, because I think we all would be very excited to see that. And then the other aspect I just wanted to obviously and I love that in the last few years, especially Matt, that you've been making sure that we're doing as much as possible in terms of DEI and the equity piece, like in terms of social equity and just equity in general. Are there pieces of legislation with regards to transportation and its impacts that we're thinking about supporting at the legislative level as well?
So I'm gonna give you a very similar answer. So we have separately a study of equity in transit operations for NCTD, that scope of work ready to go out to bid. And I think that's going to help. Pardon me? It's posted. It's now posted. That's going to give us a significant baseline of really taking a look at it. And our focus is it's going to be a lot more tangible than what people talk about typically when we talk about equity, because sometimes it can be ephemeral discussions about what are the goals we're trying to achieve. I'll give you guys a little bit of inside ballpark discussion about like the district. One of the things is healthcare costs within our internal organization about how do you handle the increased cost of healthcare. This is a decision I'm working through for the agency, and the equity twist of this for me is about you know what, we can't make everybody whole, but then if we can't make everybody whole, then we need to prioritize. And then we should prioritize those at a household income level if we can, to really take care of those people who have families or making 50,000 or less, or because that is going to have a disproportionate burden on those individuals. So we're tracking, I don't know how much the legislation, a lot of it's going to be what we do, how we engage, and identification of people and instruments to help us do a better job of engagement. Because, you know, this is something I'm gonna criticize the executive director and elected officials all alike. We all try to act as if we know what folks want and need. And sometimes it's because it may seem appealing and sexy to us. This whole equity discussion is really about getting closer to understanding what is truly needed. You know, what really makes a meaningful difference to people in their lives in a much more tangible way that I think that everybody can get behind, because that's the goal. It's something everyone can get behind and push forward.
Cool, thank you. And then let's see, so for TO, transit oriented development, I know is something that everyone keeps talking about. It's like the buzzword, you know, everyone's talking about it. So one of the things I just wanted to ask with regards to our agency, and, you know, obviously I know we're involved in some of that and thoughts around it. Just again, curious on that particular front, whether it's advocacy or looking for funding for those particular projects. What does that look like with this particular agenda as well?
So at this point, we're not asking, we're expecting those projects to pencil out from, you know, as a public-private partnership. There could be instances where you get into projects where you would be looking for grants to help offset some of the public improvements. I think some of those sprinter line projects where you're not going to be able to do significant, intense and dense developments like potentially could be done in Oceanside or Carlsbad or other locations, that you would want to kind of show the compelling evidence of who this is going to benefit, and how this reconfiguration in terms of maybe doing away with all the parking lot space and configuring in a different way so that you can put the housing on there. So by and large, the initial projects that you're hearing about are in that. Escondido may be an opportunity, because we're working through with them not only just our property, but with the city potentially combining other parcels to even further enhance the potential for broad scale development opportunities. So those things come up. There are already grant opportunities are available. It's just that we haven't yet gotten to a point where for a project that is active that we needed to specifically do that.
Okay.
We did though apply for funding for the Escondido land swap.
Yeah.
And that so it was to study, as Matt mentioned, is it feasible for us to swap parcels with the city of Escondido so that we can develop the land that's closest to the downtown area, things like that. That study will inform if there is a need for legislation at the city level to change land use, things like that.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. Last question is around, I know we always get obviously like what the legislative agenda is, and then of course we get an update on the legislative platform, and, you know, just the board approves that. I'm just curious if we have, and this might have been a question I've asked previously, a public document that's a working document that's like almost like, I know again, our city, I had actually asked them to update it because it hadn't been updated in like a really long time, and it looks amazing now. I have to say they did a great job, but they followed like League of Cities kind of guideline where it's like, you know, under sustainability, you have these pieces of legislation that the board would allow for the legislative director to then just move on with the chair's approval, obviously. But I just was curious if we have something like under sustainability, under public safety, fiscal responsibility, you know, all those different things that it's just easy for us to follow. Because like right now, when I look at this, and I'll just give an example, it would be nice to have, you know, like a little parentheses saying this would fall under our sustainability, you know, plank, or this would fall under our fiscal responsibility plank or public safety plank, so that I can be like, okay, I can go back to my city and say from this particular standpoint, NCTD is delivering on these particular things and advocating on these particular things. And from a board perspective, it's just easier. Like, I'm sure there are many of us that resonate with certain values. It's just easier for us to be like, okay, this would be something that I can get behind versus like, I might question this more or something like that. So just curious if we have that, and if not, maybe a homework item. Or
Yeah, we can definitely do, definitely we could do that for the monthly tract legislation report. I don't think that it would be a feat to break it out by topic.
Yeah.
Because it does throughout the year as they introduce more legislation, it gets to be like 10 pages.
Yeah.
So we can certainly add that. It's public in that sense, but it's as it exists now is not something that board members could edit or anything like that, but we can discuss that with
Yeah. No,
maybe our IT department.
so I guess, sorry, and I should be more clear. What I meant was like just having something that's a standing document that we would have for forever, basically, right? Like, it's just like almost like our go-to. I don't want to use religious text, but our go-to to be able to just say, hey, like, these are the things that we definitely stand for, and that our board has the ability, like, you can just streamline what we would be taking positions on, so that it's just, I mean, obviously we're doing it here, but it just makes it so much easier because you don't have to come back to us all the time. You can say, like, for sure, these are things that we are definitely approving, but then otherwise, like, X, Y, and Z will come back to the chair, or X, Y, and Z will come back to the board. But I just think like having that working document for like the public to even know, like, again, it falls within our mission and vision and everything. It allows for people to know, okay, like, this is the advocacy they're doing. They, like, the board completely supports this thing, and then maybe revamping it every 2 years, like with the legislative cycle or something to that regard, where we revamp it and just figure out, okay, where is the legislature going with whatever, you know, and can we add other planks now that things are, you know, changing.
Yeah, and in fact, let's talk offline and then we re-engage to make sure we're going point, because I do think there's an opportunity. We have a really, really outstanding document that Mary develops, the discretionary grant strategy document. I think merging the legislative program and the discretionary into one document, doing that breakout in that core values elements that you're talking about really is a value add, because I know when we're working with our congressional staff, local staff, everyone loves the fact that we have this document that identifies these specific project priorities and strategies for doing it. But we do need to marry it up with our overall legislative strategy and highlight kind of the whole board leadership and philosophy around this as you're articulating. So Mary will connect with you and Chris and walk through, because I do think bringing those together really creates the opportunity for a very spiffy document that along the lines of what you're saying.
I would like to be a fly on the wall in that.
Yeah,
Can
of
you
course.
copy me?
Yeah, of course.
No,
Right, and
it's exciting. I mean, my city's work plan, we have those 3 basic core values, and everything that we put in work plan, it has to fall under one of those. And it's really important because, you know, if this is something that is environmental, if it's, you know, a quality of life or planning, you know, land use, what is it and where's it hitting, and what's that impact to residents? So yeah,
Absolutely.
it's great.
So
It's a yes or no. So I know first when I came on board, I was like, hey, do we have a climate action plan? And you said no. So is this our first climate action plan or?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Now I'm just super stoked to hear about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
No, Madam Chair.
I know. We call my office the law office. Very good. So we do have one closed session item. This is pursuant to Government Code Section 54957.6, Public Employee Performance Evaluation for Executive Director Matthew Tucker.
Ms. Winfrey, please bring us back from closed session.
Yes, so the executive committee met in closed session in accordance with NCTD Board Policy Number 3 to evaluate the performance of the executive director. The executive committee has rated Mr. Tucker's performance as exceptional and has proposed a performance enhancement to be agendized and considered by the full board at its October 20th, 2022 regular meeting. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Suhal, are there any remaining public speakers?
No, Madam Chair.
At this time, public registration to speak on this item has ended. The next scheduled meetings are the RSCE committee meeting, October 13th, 2022 at 2 p.m. MSPBD, that's MISPEDA committee meeting at October 18th at 1 p.m. And our regular board meeting, October 20th, 2022 at 2 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Great meeting, and it's adjourned.
Yes.
The longest executive committee meeting in the history of NCTD by at least a factor of 5. 30 items.